Hello everybody, and welcome to this third video in our series, Catholicism and Therapy, or Therapy and Catholicism. Tonight we're going to be speaking about the idea of the cognitive therapies. So just to recap, we've spoken about in our first video the philosophical underpinnings of this understanding of how we can redeem therapies, and in the second video we thought a little bit more about the structure of the human person and the mindfulness-based therapies and how we can redeem them. So this video is going to move up on our list of human faculties and is going to provide some understandings about how we can deal with the cognitive and behavioral traditions of psychotherapy, which are the most popular approaches to psychotherapy in general. So we're going to look at how we can do this. That being said, what's very important to remember is that when we're dealing with these kind of things, we really need to, we truly need to understand the general thing that we're trying to do. And again, we want to keep in mind that our goal in therapy is to form people according to becoming a human. And the only way, unfortunately, that we can do that is through the influence of the divine. Because if we use the mindfulness-based therapies that we discussed in our last video, for example, we end up making people into something like the Star Wars character Yoda. So they are very zoned out, they are not disturbed, but yet they are not human in their emotions. They are not human in what they are. The cognitive therapies that we're going to discuss in this video, if you just do these isolated from a Catholic anthropology, you end up creating people to be something like the Star Trek character Spock, who is rational. And ultimately, the great sadness of these things is that they fail to do what they set out to do. Because if we look at things like rational emotive behavior therapy, they don't fully come to understand they don't really allow us to be rational. They don't really aim for these things. There is great beauty, usefulness, and insight in these approaches, but they are damaging ultimately because they have many toxic elements. So, let's begin by explaining what is redeemable. If you are a therapy practitioner, what do I think is redeemable from the cognitive therapies? There are some elements that I think are useful. Number one is the idea that we can question our thoughts. Number two is the idea that we can do this in a structured way, such as on a worksheet, a thought record, or something like that. Number three would be something like that we can use certain questions to elicit the thoughts that we are having problems with, and certain questions to put to the thoughts, to kind of debate them or wonder whether they are true. That's helpful. And the idea, of course, of finding the replacement thoughts. Now, what's problematic is that sometimes the approach may have some underlying assumptions, such that we should question all of our religious thoughts, or that religion is not rational and therefore should be all the thoughts related to religion should be dismissed. That is a traditional assumption of normal mainstream REBT, for example, is that religion is atheistic. You know, it's against religion is one of its general premises. Although there are practitioners that have used it in a religious context, where you will see things like a redeemed cognitive. You'll see even some faith-based REBT practitioners. Then you'll also find a method which is by a man whose last name is Bacchus, and his method is he writes books. I think the book is called "Telling Yourself the Truth," I believe is the title of the book, and this is kind of a redeemed, different type of version of a cognitive therapy from a Christian perspective. But there are elements that are problematic, and so this could be the atheistic overtones or incomplete replacement thoughts. So, for example, or incorrect goals. So like in REBT, one of the type of replacement thoughts could be a person cannot be rated in any way, meaning like I cannot be evaluated, nothing can define me, my worth, or anything like that. There could be some truth to that, but that is an incomplete understanding of self-identity, because there's more to it in a Christian perspective than merely that. It doesn't mean that there's no truth at all to the idea that I can't be defined by my height, my weight, my age, my quickness, my failures, my successes. But there is an element in which I am a sinner. There's an element in which I am loved, yet loved by God. It's not merely this zeroed out, balanced thing of I can't be rated at all. So this is an incorrect type of replacement thought, an incorrect end goal, an incorrect ideological, or an incomplete or incorrect ideological assumption is there. Similarly, there might be incorrect moral assumptions. Like there might be this sense in REBT that we should dismiss all of our moral values and that, oh, there's no reason why I shouldn't do this or I shouldn't do that. That's just a culturally conditioned thing. There's no reason why I should believe that. That's not rational. Let's get rid of all my moral restrictions. So these, of course, are out of harmony even with reason itself, because REBT, on one hand, eliminates many things. As Albert Ellis will say, it eliminates much of the human ego, meaning, in his sense, selfishness, basically, or this type of thing. But it also permits much immoral. It's used often in its clinical application. It's kind of the sense of that we should have what one popular person called shameless happiness, in a sense. We should have this sense of getting rid of our restrictions because we now become rational rather than religious, or or rational rather than believing our parents. And some of these things, there are elements where we should shed dysfunctional ways of holding our religious heritage or upbringing, but this doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so there are elements in the end result that can be problematic, meaning, okay, I can't be rated, but there's more to it. There's more truths about the self than just that, for example, in Christianity. And there are moral truths. We don't want to have something that's atheistic. And there's also some problems, you could maybe have some better ways of questioning thoughts. Like, so for example, we can also, the questioning methods merely say, okay, does this, so for example, things like RET of Maxime Maltzby, that's similar to REBT. He basically things like, does this help me achieve my desirable goals? Does this protect my life and health? Is this true? Is this rational? These type of thoughts like that he'll use as questions for the thought. Now the thing is, those thoughts, those questioning methods aren't that bad. They're good. They can be healthy, but they don't go far enough. They don't say like, what does the church say? What does the Bible say? What does Scripture say? These type of things. There's some other type of ways that we can evaluate these thoughts. Other than merely do they make me happy? How do they make me feel? And these are important parts. We need these parts of the inquiry, but it's not necessarily the only thing we can ask. So there might be some more questions we could ask and try to have some. So for example, someone may say, okay, the thought that I'm a dredge and I'm not worth anything. Okay, does that help me achieve my goals? No. But we can also ask, is that what God would say about me? And say, okay, maybe God would say you're a sinner. Or maybe it would say you're a sinner and you are infinitely loved and God died for you, and you could have this much richer understanding of who you are, rather than like, okay, well, yeah, well, okay, it's just like, okay, why I don't like this thought. That's all you got when you have that. So there might be some other questions you could ask. The other thing we might say, I think. Again, I think there's good things from cognitive therapy. The thing is that we just don't want to have it be isolated. The thing also to remember is that cognitive therapy is similar in its scope and understanding to Stoicism. But the thing is that the difference between cognitive therapy and Stoicism is that its metaphysics, I believe, are different. So the rational way of being rational, as the Greek and Roman philosophy of Stoicism would talk about, has a certain understanding of the world and the way the world is. So just in the same way, the cognitive therapies propose something of an evolutionary worldview. So, for example, the language like maladaptive, meaning adaptation to the environment, is very evolutionary. Even the idea that we are moving past religious thoughts or irrational thoughts to rational thoughts, this progressive type of understanding, in a sense, um, which is slightly different than the metaphysics and science of the Greeks, which maybe would have a different way of understanding things. But there's an essential element in similarity. Like the mindfulness therapies we spoke about in the last video are related to uh, the religion of Buddhism. The the cognitive therapies are analogous to the religion of Stoicism. People will call it a philosophy, but it was a religion. It's what a religion is, even if you want to call it a philosophy, of Stoicism. And so there's some interesting things, like you can read some books like The Porch and the Cross by Dr. Kevin Vost. God, I believe he passed away, so God rest his soul. Um, so Dr. Kevin Vost wrote The Porch and the Cross. Was a useful book to read, although I think the presentation of Stoicism, I think, is a little bit too optimistic in my view. I think that there needs to be more modification. It could be worth reading the works of the original Stoics, such as Epictetus and Seneca. They were viewed, I think, even by the early Christians as so valuable that sometimes there was some people gave some credence to some forged letters between St. Paul and Seneca because of the large amounts of compatibility between the Stoic worldview and the Christian worldview. And so there's some quite useful things ethically and spiritually, and there's a lot of richness there that you can explore. And the other book that's very interesting for understanding how do we can't really just take on Stoicism. A really good book though is by C. Cavan Rowe. Um, it's called, I'm trying to remember what it was called, but I think it's something like Only One Truth or something like that. It's really a very beautiful book about Stoicism and Christianity. And it's a very deep reflection on how we can't really, we have to always have a base of understanding. So we can understand uh, Stoicism as a Christian, but we can't really Stoicism really, we have to use it from a Christian perspective because we can't even really understand Stoicism. We can't go into it's a beautiful the book is really very profound. It's hard for me to explain. Basically, it says you have to understand an ideology from the inside. You can only really understand it the way that you feel when you are that ideology, when you are a member of it. Like you have to be inside of it. And you can't really do that. Like you can't, as a Christian, like all of a sudden somehow make yourself also into a Stoic. You have to you're integrating one from one perspective or the other from the other perspective. And so it's a very profound reflection on the nature of thought. So it's just a good book that you can read um, in relation to that. Um, but the thing also is that if you read books as a therapist on REBT, you'll find that sometimes they'll talk about how it's similar to postmodern philosophy. That doesn't make any. I mean, you can make some arguments about it, but the thing is, ultimately, a REBT relies on giving a person a new philosophy, relies on questioning thoughts. If we don't have an ideology that is deeply rooted in there being truth and there being falsehood, rational therapies don't make much sense. So they need to have, they'll do better situated in a Catholic context than in the normal, everyday context of current postmodern Western society. It's not going to help them to see themselves as in step with this thing because the modern society doesn't provide for truth or falsehood. So how could you even be questioning things? Because then anything could be true. So then your thoughts really, if they're dysfunctional thoughts, well, okay, well they're not working for you, so get rid of it. So it just kind of undermines itself when you have this sense of no being no truth. So again, that could be a problem, or even it just seems like a not so great understanding that the practitioners have. They think that it's good to not have truth for these therapies, but I don't think that's helpful. Um, so those are some things I would say about the cognitive therapies. And I think that REBT is the one I mostly discussed, and it's very interesting that I think something that's useful of REBT is its understanding of emotion, an understanding of healthy and unhealthy emotional states is similar, and unhealthy and healthy thoughts. It's similar but not equivalent to the types of healthy emotions that are authentically Christian, and the type of attitudes that are authentically Christian. So, for example, um, in REBT, you might say, I strongly prefer that things go my way, but it would be all right if they don't. And therefore, that would lead to concern instead of anxiety. So that is almost correct as an attitude. So for example, there would be a type of Christian concern that would be different than anxiety, which would come from a similar thought form, meaning I would like things to, oh Lord, I would like saying something like, Lord, I would like things to go this way, but I trust your will, and and I trust what you'll do. That's a slightly different qualitative difference between just that rational balanced thought. You now have this kind of supernaturalized balanced thought, which gives you a different qualitative type of concern than you get from the REBT. So these differences in thought structure and emotional flavor are evident there. And so there's different levels, and so it doesn't really get you to where you really need to be. Um, that being said, so that's some things to be said about REBT. There's also some things we might say about CBT, but again, like CBT, I feel like CBT is something that I haven't explored as much as in terms of thinking about it as REBT. And CBT is generally pretty simple, in my opinion, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily concern itself so much with these philosophical things as much as it just kind of just makes you question your thinking and kind of look for thinking errors, and understand the relations between thoughts, feelings, and actions. So it's not bad to think about that thoughts, feelings, and actions influence each other. That's not terrible. Not a terrible idea. That's an okay thing to think about. You know, but I think the thing to remember is also there's also some very good books. One of the books is um, it's by what's his name? Trying to think of the name. It's Aaron Beck's Cognitive Therapy, and it's like the therapy of the fathers or something. I'll have to look at it and maybe put it in the notes here. It's by it's by a bishop of the Eastern Orthodox Church who is I just had the name on the tip of my tongue. Well, I'll try to think about it. But there's a very good book that should be read by everybody. Everybody should read this book. I don't necessarily agree with 100% of the thesis because sometimes there's a sense that we should separate the cognitive therapy from the orthodox from the spirituality, and I don't really believe. I believe we need to expand the spirituality with the therapy rather than keep them separate, so to speak. But there's so much beautiful things in that thing. I just want to see if it's next to me. Um, let's see. Well, I don't see it next to me right now, but it's really a very good book, and it's by I can't think of the guy's name, but it's really but read that book. I'll put it somewhere in the notes about the show or whatever, or the description of the video when I find it. But those are some things I would say about the cognitive therapies. The other thing we want to talk about in this video, um, we had so we began on our first of kind of these more descriptive videos. It's like saying, okay, here's the mindfulness therapies. That's awareness. Now we kind of went to, you know, we jumped up a few notches here. We went toward the thinking mind. We talked about the cognitive therapies. We talked about some of the benefits and drawbacks of them. To remember this, just there's a faculty in the middle here. There's a faculty here that's in the middle, which is imagination. And so imagination can be used in the mindfulness therapies in the sense of visualizations for relaxation, or it could be used in the cognitive therapies in the sense of using the mind as a way of preparing ourselves for something bad happening or rehearsing a new behavior or something like that. So there are multiple uses of the imagination, like either for relaxation or for preparation and practice or reworking our thinking. So, for example, in the mindfulness therapies, we might do like a healing visualization or something, or relaxation technique, or guided imagery, or something like that. Of course, we don't want to do anything weird in terms of healing. Um, there's a lot we could say on these subjects. We don't want to do something weird on that. We don't want to do um, we also don't want to do guided meditations that have strange content, meaning occult content or things that are from other ideologies. But if somebody wishes to imagine a peaceful lake or look at a peaceful scene very simply in their mind, there's nothing intrinsically wrong about that. Of course, it could give some scandal if we're doing something like this in the context of, okay, you're in a yoga studio with like some weird statues around, and now imagine that you're in India. Okay, it's gonna getting into some bad territory, just because it's like because you're using like you're imagining something, or like, well, yes, imagine that you go to the spirit world. Okay, now we're doing funky stuff. But the thing is, like, imagine you're at a lake and look at the duck swimming. I mean, that's just a thing to calm you down. It's fine. Or the use of the imagination in the things like they have things like rational emotive imagery. So, for example, there are things where a person might, in those traditions um, of REBT, they might kind of rehearse a situation, imagine themselves thinking a different thing and doing a different thing. Things like that can be redeemable as well. I mean, it's helpful. It can be helpful if you want to do it in a faith-based way. Sometimes maybe there's all different ways you could bring in Jesus. Okay, imagine Jesus is by your side in the visualization, or you could imagine the thoughts that you'd be having would be more of a faith-affirming type of a thought rather than just these rational thoughts. So it's nothing really wrong with using visualization in that way. In the same way, you can use the approach of negative visualization in the sense of imagining the bad thing that you think you don't want to have happen in a dispassionate way, meaning you kind of imagine it happening to you and just kind of see it and look through it, the whole thing, and just kind of just accept it and notice it, and that's it. That's a stoic technique of preparing yourself for what is going to come and just having that dispassionate attitude. Now, it's you might want to do it a little bit differently. There might be some ways of tweaking it, but it doesn't mean that the general type of exercise is incorrect. Um, so there could be some tweaks there that might be needed, but these are some things that could be redeemable in visualization. And so that's why visualization is something that you might find in multiple therapy approaches. And it's just so that's why I wanted to mention that skill, because I don't want to leave out parts of your instrument tray. So we've talked about the first video the mindfulness therapies, and now we talked about the cognitive therapies. Now we're going to talk a little bit in the next video probably about the behavioral therapies. But I wanted to mention the visualization because there really aren't specific approaches that talk about visualization as the main thing. There are mindfulness, the awareness ones, and there are cognitive ones. So those benchmarks are kind of what I'm focusing on. But it's important to realize that your instrument tray as a therapist does include visualization techniques, and they can be found in some different therapies. So we've talked so far about the mindfulness therapies, the imaginal therapies, so to speak, the cognitive therapies. And so I would like to briefly mention the behavioral therapies, because the behavioral therapies, quite simply, the behavioral theories are not really redeemable in the sense they talk about things like philosophical premises, like the real question is whether people even like the question is not whether machines can think, but whether people can think. Well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, these kind of ideologies of behaviorism that the only thing that matters is what can be measured externally, and there's no thoughts. That's not a sensible way of thinking because everybody knows that people think. So behaviorism as an ideology or as a thought is not very helpful, and so we don't want to we don't want to keep that. We want to change that. It doesn't mean, of course, to simply redeem that would be to say, okay, what people do is important, and we should measure stuff. That'll help us get things done. Yeah, it's good. Measuring things is good. Thinking only the measurable exists, not good. And the same way, to think that only people are merely conditioned, that people are merely only behaving because of reward and punishment, is not effective, because people sacrifice their lives. They don't only obey those rewards and punishment, but yet these things could be useful for generating strategies for managing behavior or doing things like that. But at the same time, they can involve reductionistic understandings of the human person and human motivation that are not effective. They can help us understand learning, but they also could potentially help us misunderstand learning, because they assume that we are merely these learning machines that are for reward and punishment, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that we can't use these things. There's also some useful ideas like exposure therapy, like behavioral interventions. Like, okay, I'm going to know how to relax, and then I'm going to put myself in new situations. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to take action. I'm going to go and ride the elevator when I'm afraid of the elevator. These interventions are effective. Of course, the person can pray as well as simply just relax or think rationally in order to, go on the elevator. But there are behavioral interventions. There are usefulness to these things. There's usefulness of reward and punishment. Every parent knows this. And there's usefulness in the research done on like how to do things effectively with rewarding children, for example. But it doesn't mean that this is the be-all, end-all of the understanding of human motivation, and we have to take things with a grain of salt if they go too far into thinking that people are merely behavioral machines. So there are some things that are useful in the behavioral understanding, and doing things differently is a part of any kind of therapy anyway. So we've now thought about these type of things, and and there's different exercises. Like even Father Irala talks about training the will. There's a book, I think, by Father Basil Maturan, The Education of the Will. There's a book by Father Miguel Angel Fuentes. He writes. So Miguel Angel Fuentes writes the book I Want to, The Formation of the Will. So this is some of these books are effective things to look at for this. But the will is something that we want to be able to form and grow and do things with. So you have just gone through a whole bunch of the pieces of the instrument tray of being a therapist and being and the thing is, of course, if you're a client, should you let people do weird visualizations with you? No, you'd be like, okay, we've got to do this in a way that's acceptable to me. Okay, like I can imagine a lake, but I'm not going to imagine my energy centers in my body or something that's not from my faith. I can, I can think differently. I can question my thoughts, but I also want to think thoughts that are in harmony with my faith. I can do a behavioral experiment. That's fine. But I don't want to only be reduced to behaviors. It's like I can do. So the thing is, like, it's just, I don't, maybe reward and punishment is not the only thing, that we want to think about to analyze ourselves and how we become the way we are. So these are some different ideas that are useful from these things, and some ideas that aren't useful from these things, just so we start to get a Catholic perspective in general on these other approaches. In our next video, we're going to dive into the idea of the 12-step approaches, and to really unpack these ideas, And eventually we're going to also get to the analytic approaches, because in all of these videos, we've been laying out the instrument tray um, of the therapist, of the client. We haven't been so much looking at the diagnostic tests of, what are the ways that people are motivated. We've been really looking at methods that allow us to use our faculties to control our lower faculties, not methods of analysis of what is being controlled. So that's another set of theories, such as the Freudian theories. Even behaviorism, we mentioned, is an idea of like, okay, conditioning is why you're doing everything. The existential theories, like, okay, you're seeking meaning, or you're dealing with the fear of death, or these things. Looking at what is our motivation is a whole other area of analysis, as opposed to part of practical treatment. So we'll look at these theories as well in future videos. So stay tuned for more episodes of Therapy and Catholicism.